Let's look at the Native American stone-headed war club. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now you're normally used to me talking about medieval and Renaissance weapons, sometimes 18th and 19th century weapons and things like this. Mostly kind of Eurocentric and sometimes touching on Indian or Japanese weapons as my desires take me. However, I have in the past looked a bit at tomahawks, okay, iron-headed tomahawks, sometimes brass-headed tomahawks actually, but metal-headed tomahawks. And there's no avoiding the fact that these were imported items to the Americans, Native Americans, in the colonial era when the Europeans were moving into parts of America and obviously gradually taking over vast swathes of America. But what came before those were things like this. In fact, there's a whole vast array of different types of Native American war clubs. Some of you will be very familiar with them. But some are more associated with certain groups than others. Some of them are quite widespread and spread across different tribal or national groupings of Native Americans. But this is a type of stone-headed club that is quite famous for its use in the Wild West, essentially, the American West, the frontier. Now, that's not to say that types of club like this didn't exist before and in other parts of America before the Europeans turned up. I'm absolutely certain that they did. For a second, I'll just mention, from an archaeologist background, if this was in the ground for a few hundred years, what would be left of it? The stone head, and that's it. The rest of it would disappear. And often when we're looking at anthropology and archaeology, it becomes very, very difficult to talk about certain types of weapons, Stone Age hand axes from Europe, for example, because we often don't know how they were attached to the shaft because we don't have the organic elements remaining. In this case, we do. This is a reconstruction, but obviously in 19th century America, many of these were gathered up and stuck into museums or sold to travellers and tourists and people like this, sometimes taken in war as souvenirs. But there's a whole bunch of them in museums and floating around in collections. This isn't a very old one, but it is one that I believe was made by Native Americans in the traditional methods, using the traditional materials. And it does come from America, it's not made in England or anything like that. So this is a Native American stone-headed club that is, in every way that I'm aware of, identical to 19th century and even earlier examples, but it is a 20th century creation. It's been in someone's collection and ended up with me, basically. But it's been in their collection since, I think, the sort of mid-20th century. So this is, to all intents and purposes, just like the ones that were used on the plains by the Plains Indians in America, let's say in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, 80s, all the way up to 1900. These were used alongside iron-headed, or rather metal-headed tomahawks. So the famous tomahawk, sometimes with a pipe integrated into it, sometimes not, were used alongside these. Now, one thing that's always fascinated me is how did a Native American choose whether to use an iron-headed tomahawk or brass-headed tomahawk, or one of these? And it doesn't always seem to be to do with wealth or status. So you might think, well, if they could afford or trade or win one of the metal-headed ones, then they'd use that. If they didn't, they'd have a traditionally made stone-headed one like this. But I don't think it's that simple. Looking at photographs, written sources, museum records of these, it seems that some Native Americans continued using the more traditional forms of war club and stone-headed, I mean, we could call this a mace in a way, but I'll come to that in a second. They did decide to use these more traditional ones, I think sometimes for other reasons, what they represented, cultural references. Sometimes they were handed down, so they would have been, if this was grandfather's stone-headed mace, then I'm still going to use this because it worked for him and it worked for me. I'm not going to use one of those newfangled iron-headed ones. So I think it's very, very complex, and sometimes I think what these represent is sometimes more important than necessarily the physical reality of, is a iron-headed, steel-headed tomahawk more effective than this? Yes, in some ways, and perhaps no in other ways. So let's look at the physical characteristics of this. Now, I'm going to put this down just for a second because I want you to consider something. If we go back into prehistory, and remember prehistory means different things in different parts of the world, it just means before recorded or written history. So in some parts of the world, that's relatively recent. But In many parts of the world, this is the most fundamental weapon. That's right, a stick. In this case, with a knob on the end. So this is actually a walking stick, but it's a knob kerry inspired South African walking stick. So this is from Africa. But wooden knob-headed sticks like this, which are the most fundamental and basic form of mace, seem to have been all over the world, from Fiji to Africa to the Americas to Northern Europe, all over the place. These are the most fundamental type of weapon, and they more or less don't survive in archaeology. The only way that they would survive archaeologically is if they go into a bog or, you know, essentially a waterlogged environment where somehow wood survives, an anaerobic environment. But for the most part, things like this don't survive. But we do see wooden-headed sticks being used to strike with in art. So we know they were pretty much everywhere, and it's no big surprise, is it? Because the most fundamental weapon, even before you've got stone, you know, flint heads or obsidian, wherever you are in the world, but stone-headed weapons or bone-headed weapons, if we're talking about certain parts of the world where flint wasn't available. So sometimes horn or tooth or bone were used for tips of weapons. Before these things, fundamentally what you have is a stick. Now, how is this different to a stick? And this is the fundamental question that I think is important to answer when we're talking about these stone-headed war clubs. And I will also reiterate, while we're using a Native American example here, this does potentially apply to all stone-headed maces or axes, whether it's ancient Egyptian stone-headed maces, which we know were used in the Old Kingdom, or if we're talking about Northwest Europe, for example, where stone-headed axes were used in various ways, sometimes perhaps in the hand, sometimes perhaps attached to a wooden shaft or other organic material shaft in various ways. Why is this a better weapon than this? And it's really about density of material. Okay, so fundamentally I could make a really big knob on the end of this stick, but it would have to be really big to be heavy enough to strike with an awful lot of force. Now this weapon as it is quite quick, because this is pretty damned light. This weapon on the other hand is not so quick. It's much more top heavy, and it actually feels, if I close my eyes, it actually feels quite similar to a medieval mace. So this isn't a particularly quick weapon, but it's incredibly hard hitting. Now, not only is it hard hitting because it has a concentration of mass at the end, but it's also a very hard head. And this is relevant when you're smashing people in the head. Now, why do I talk specifically about smashing people in the head? Because in one of my previous videos, if you search the word tomahawk in my videos, I went through some period accounts of the use of tomahawks. And now in that case, it's mostly speaking about metallic-headed tomahawks. But it is noteworthy that tomahawks in Native America, in North America, by Native Americans, were almost entirely, not almost entirely, but let's say by overwhelming majority used to hit to the head. And this partially, I believe, is because strikes to a lot of other parts of the body are not going to be fight-ending. Yes, you could hit someone in the arm or the leg or the body with a tomahawk, but for the most part, that isn't a very high surety of putting them out of action, whereas hitting them in the head is. Funnily enough, we see a similar thing with these knob-headed sticks. If we look at, for example, Sir Richard Francis Burton's accounts of the Somalians using sticks and clubs against him, then indeed they went for the head. We know from stick fighting traditions in Africa, they go for the head. And it kind of makes sense. Okay, now, if you're striking the head, the skull is a surprisingly hard and bony mass. It's not soft and squishy. It's designed by nature to be really resistant to blows. And you know, there's been all sorts of research in recent times into how the cranial structure of the face is reinforced. Obviously, we've got brow ridges, which are more predominant in men, probably because men, at least by survival of the fittest, have most often been involved in combat in past times, and therefore they have evolved to sustain blows, punches, strikes, stick hits, whatever, to the head and the face. So this is a hard old object. Now, if we've got a concentrated mass of stone that is also hard, that makes it more effective at cracking skulls. Quite simply, because bone, living bone, is not that different to the consistency of wet wood or living, say, green wood. How do I know this? I know this because I've chopped up freshly killed carcasses of animals, but also done various other experiments, and I've been an archaeologist and I've excavated lots of skeletons. And I've also looked at wound injuries from battlefields and stuff like that. Now, yes, indeed, if someone smacks you in the head with this, it is going to hurt a lot. However, if they hit you with this, there's going to be more transference of energy through the skull and breaking the skull. And that's a very important point to make. Not only does the denser material concentrate that energy into a smaller surface area than the stick would, where for the same mass you'd have to make a much larger surface area, but in addition, this wood has some degree of flex and absorption and softness to it, essentially, when hitting hard objects, which a stone-headed club don't. Okay, so, right, enough of that. Essentially, a stone head is going to have a more immediate effect on a head than a wooden head is. Now, that does make the weapon unwieldy, and what consequences does that have for our interpretation of how these were used? Well, I've been thinking about this. Now, a stick is a very interesting thing that you can block and parry with. It's relatively rigid, it's quite springy. This, on the other hand, as most of the originals are, is a very thin and somewhat flexible wooden shaft. They didn't put a fat wooden shaft on this, they put a thin one. That means that this hard egg-like stone lump at the end is essentially attached to my hand via a long, thin strip, which isn't very rigid. I can't really block with it. Not only is it very top-heavy and therefore unwieldy to block with, but additionally, if you did receive a strike on there, it kind of gives and flexes, and it feels like it might break, actually. Whereas when I swing it, what's essentially happening is if you imagine a heavy lump at the end of a cord or a rope, and you swing it, that rope and cord becomes rigid until it hits the object. So in a way, I'm not going to go as far as to say this is like a flail or anything like that, but in a way, this is a bit like a projectile deliverer. It's essentially a stone on a stick, but the stick isn't really very much of the striking mechanism. If I hit someone with that, I mean, you can see I'm hitting my arm with that, it's fine. However, if I did that on my arm, it's probably going to really, really hurt, or possibly even fracture my arm bone. Okay, so the consequences are that in offensive terms, when I'm hitting someone, I absolutely have to make sure I hit them with that knob end. With a stick, I could hit them with any part of the stick and still have quite a lot of effect, although it's going to be more effective with the heavy end. With this one, it is so concentrated up there and so skinny down here that I've basically taken all of the offensive potential away from here and concentrated it all up there. So yes, it's going to be super effective smashing the head with that stone, but far less effective down here. That means I've got to be more accurate in offensive terms. Now, in defensive terms, it means that, say for example, we've got two equally armed people and they're both armed with these. If they're swinging at me and I'm swinging at them, yes, I could deflect the thing. I can't really block the thing because this is very top heavy, so that's going to aid to any kind of guard or parry collapsing, but this is very, very flimsy. If you put a lot of energy into this, there's a good chance this will bend or break depending on how it's made. It is wrapped with rawhide, incidentally, which makes it a sort of laminate and pretty strong. But nevertheless, it's not comfortable to parry with, and it's not balanced right to parry with. However, if a blow's incoming, coming down at my head here, cut number one in sabre method, for example, there are ways I could defend from it by sweeping the thing aside, either with what would be the false edge, the back, okay, or the front. And this is something we actually see in medieval treatises, done with things like the Langmesser or indeed the arming sword as well, and sticks, it has to be said. If you look in Fury, he does it with wooden sticks. So if a blow's coming in here, rather than trying to stop it, the best thing to do is sweep the thing out of the way, creating an opening for my own strike. So indeed, you could fight with these solo, single. But to defend against the strikes, you would have to get into the habit either of sweeping the thing aside upwards or downwards, or using your offhand somehow to come in close as the blow's coming in and intercept the shaft and launch in your own strike. So you've got duo tempo or single tempo, so double time or single time actions there. Person strikes at me, I could defend, come in and strike them in the head, or person strikes at me, I could defend against the shaft while closing in and smack them in the head. So you've got a bunch of different fighting options which are basically universal to martial arts across the centuries from all over the world, whether it's African martial arts or Asian martial arts, European martial arts, whatever, and Native American. Right, so that's the first thing to say. Yes, you could fight with these alone. However, because of the top-heavy nature of these and the fact that they've got a huge amount of striking energy, just like any mace or axe or warhammer, but they're not very nimble, I don't think they're very well suited to defence. They're better suited to offence. And so why not just specialise in offending with this thing? So what do you do with defending? The answer, I would say, is a shield. Now, we find that by the well-recorded age of Native American warfare, firearms have become so important, and of course they were still using bows with with arrows, still using archery in the 19th century, but firearms have become so prevalent that shields had faded. But we know that shields were important in the Americas before the Europeans came, and for a fair period overlapping when the Europeans were around. We know that the Aztecs used shields from all of the artwork and the descriptions, but equally there are shields that survive in North Native American cultures. Now, in some cases those shields have become votive, they become ceremonial, and all of this kind of stuff, but we know that they're there. We know that they're a thing that was invented, that existed, and yes, they weren't very useful by the 19th century, and they weren't even used very much by the 19th century, but they existed. So they must have been used in earlier centuries before we have recorded history of. So my opinion is that this weapon comes about at a time obviously long before the Europeans appeared, and was a very common and widespread type of Native American war club that was used over a big swathe of North America, and that they were probably predominantly used in conjunction with a shield, with probably a round shield made of hide stretched over a frame, essentially. And I think that's probably what a lot of these, what became, people like the Lakota and people like that who moved onto the Western Plains, migrated away from the Europeans as they arrived and settled. I suspect that some of these tribes, a typical fighting combo was a round hide shield with a wooden or wicker frame, and one of these war clubs. And yes, indeed, sometimes their primary weapon might be a bow or spear, but in a hand-to-hand close-in combat situation, I suspect that they were defending predominantly with a shield and attacking predominantly with the stone-headed club, because it's such a specialised weapon. It is so geared towards maximum striking potential up here, while sacrificing lots of other things, which even a simple stick has. It's actually a super specialised weapon, and I think they deserve a lot more attention than they get. I hope this has been thought-provoking. I might make more videos about this. I'd be really interested if you've got superior knowledge on this topic to me. Post below, share any extra bits of information that I might have missed or might be useful for a future video talking about these. Which particular cultural groups were still using these in the 19th century? Why do you think some people use these over the iron-headed tomahawks? And do you agree? Do you agree that this was a weapon designed to be used with a shield? Because I think that they probably were. Even if you can use them by themselves, I don't think they're at all optimised for that. Thanks a lot for watching, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel soon. Cheers, folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks!